Hey everyone, and welcome back to Cow Talks. I am Marcelo, Wallau Forage Extension Specialist with the University of Florida and an agricultural producer myself. On this podcast, we explore the many facets of agricultural production systems to discuss the technical aspects and decision-making processes that shape the competitiveness and long-term sustainability of our farms and ranches. Join me in these conversations where I explore the minds of different professionals to bring multiple perspectives to the challenges and opportunities facing modern agriculture.
This episode is part one of a two-part conversation recorded right after the Corn, Silage, and Forage Field Day held in late May. Marcelo is joined by co-host Diwakar Vyas and special guest Dr. Beth Hall to explore how Florida dairies can move beyond a one best forage mindset. Together, they dig into how to build a complete forage system without sacrificing rumen health, while also discussing how to navigate Florida's unique forage deficit conditions.
Hello and welcome to Cow Talks. I'm Marcelo, Wallau Forage Extension Specialist and Associate Program Leader with the University of Florida. And today co-hosting with me is my good friend and colleague, Dr. Diwakar Vyas.
Thank you very much, Marcelo. I'm Diwakar Vyas. I'm a livestock nutritionist in the Animal Sciences Department. Glad to be here. Today's
a special day because we just finished the Corn, Silage, and Forage Field Day. And our main guest is Dr. Beth Hall. Dr. Hall is here in the studio with us after a long day in the field, looking at corn and sorghum and talking about forages and dairy nutrition and many other topics. And we're very excited to pick her brain. Dr. Hall today is a consultant with The Cows Are Always Right, which I think is a very, very inspiring name for her LLC. And she has so much knowledge in many aspects of agricultural production, of livestock management, and in the food system in general, and we're excited for that. She's a former UF-IFAS researcher in extension after spending 8 years at UF, right?
Yes, indeed.
Went to USDA for a long career working with sugars and many other things. Dr. Hall, welcome to Cow Talks.
Thank you so very much. Absolutely delighted to be here.
As we're trying to discuss here where we start this podcast, there's so many things that I'd like to ask, but I'm going to start with some of the points we discussed today. And for those folks that were not able to be at the Corn, Silage, and Forage Field Day, we're going to make available the presentation that Dr. Hall made today. And go there and take a look because there's so many good information. And one of the things I tease her about the idea of the presentation is how to put together a complete forage system, not really think about just one of the components that we tend to focus. And in our case here has been corn silage, and think about the magnitude of forages we can grow and how to put that together. I'd like to start with that, changing a little bit of the mindset of one forage is the best and that's all we can produce to what forages can we produce and how can we better use them.
I'm a dairy cattle nutritionist and have been for years. And the way I end up looking at the forages are not, okay, what is the best forage and what exactly do we want in our ration? I ask, what do we want the forage to do? Because forages have different jobs in our rations for cattle. On the one hand, we need them to be digestible so that they provide nutrients so that the animals can produce for us. But the other thing we can't forget is they have a very important job physically, where we think about effective fiber, chewable fiber, and forage is the only part of the diet typically that gives large enough particle size to keep the rumen functioning, to get the animal ruminating, and that becomes very important to make any of the rest of the diet function. So I look at the functionality of the forages, what are their strong suits, and which of them fit together in the diets we put together to meet the animals and the farm's needs. And that's the approach I take. Not what's the best forage, but how do they fit? And then we look at the farm, the environment, and decide what can we grow, what can we manage, and what fits the needs.
Thank you very much for sharing this concept, Beth. I think the reason why there is so much emphasis on corn silage is because of the type of forage quality that the corn silage provides, right? When we look at the fiber digestibility, the starch, the energy that is coming from it. And you touched upon the physical effectiveness of the fiber. So can we discuss about these two concepts, like how physical effectiveness and then the forage quality in terms of digestibility and the energy availability goes hand in hand, and how we can look at other forages, going back to Marcelo's first question, other than corn silage?
I mean, with corn silage, and especially coming primarily from the dairy perspective here, okay, it is a very good feed, and I'll call it the forage multi-tool. It can accomplish a variety of things. It can provide us with effective fiber, digestible fiber, and starch, and other digestible carbohydrates to support production. What I end up looking at is when we're in Florida, which has historically been a bit of a forage-deficit state, or hard to get the quality of forages that we'd want in the dairy herds to support high production. Corn silage is one part of that, but we've got at least 3 different portions of the year where we can grow different crops. So how do we get the total mass of forage that we need to support the herds? And corn silage is just one part of that. Typically, from what I gather from what can be produced, there were discussions about, rather obviously, we have, let's say, small grains or C3 grasses that can be grown in winter. Cropping after corn, there was discussion about some sorghums, and one that I got feedback from one of the dairy farmers has been working apparently rather well and preserving well on the farm is the male sterile sorghums that accumulate a fair amount of sugar. And that different than some sorghums that might not do that would put it in the grain instead. And so there are also new forage varieties that are coming online that we will need exploration to see how well they fit the farm's management systems and needs, and that they preserve well.
So most of the focus on the dairies here are in the corn silage, as you mentioned. There is one side that is the restriction for land. They need to grow all the silage they can because they really need that. They're land limited. And I think there's a disparity between the amount of land that they have in the number of animals they can support that land and the number of animals they have. But there is also opportunity around those dairies in many areas to grow different crops. Parenthesis here, that is also changing, especially because of the urban sprawl, especially when you think about South Florida, that is changing. A lot more land is demanded for other crops that have higher value, and people are not wanting to grow corn silage anymore because there are crops that would be more profitable. And that puts a high pressure in the dairy. But still, even in that scenario, we have the opportunity to grow different crops. We have the opportunity to grow a second and a third crop here, or at minimum 2 crops. But then there is the resistance. Well, the quality of that crop is not good enough for me to put on the cows. And I argue that's what you can grow. Instead of thinking that I cannot use it because it's not the quality I want, is how can I use it with the quality it has?
I would perceive it as a matter of looking at what any given crop's strong suit is and if it fits the dairy. Again, the discussions I was having today, Florida has been a forage deficit state, and talking to nutritional consultants, there's anywhere between 35 and let's say 45 to 50% of the diet that is forage. If you're down at 35%, some of the requirements you have of that forage and the ration you build around it are going to be very different than if you're up closer to 50%.
And that's when you end up having to bring fiber. And that's when you end up with the situation of like, how can I reduce the quality of this diet because I cannot have that high quality silage and we need to bring straw?
Well, let's start out with the notion that the quality of the forage that we have in the diet is probably going to be a major hand in limiting the performance of the animals on that diet. I mean, ruminants, cattle, evolved on forage, on grasses. And so when we domesticate them, and we decide what diets they're going to consume, it's considering their needs. I got to put a note in here. A forage deficit system or a forage limited system with dairy cattle is not what is described by most of the nutritional recommendations for diet formulation that are out there. Those are more seriously based in the North, the upper Midwest. If you're on a 35% forage diet, you get more concerned about how much of that forage is going to provide effective fiber and less about how much starch it will provide because you have that need and this is the one place to meet it. If you're very low in forage, you end up having to formulate probably with less starch, more fiber from like soy hulls or such, and possibly bringing in more sugars, more water-soluble carbohydrates to make sure that you keep the rumen functioning well. If you start pushing starch in that situation, it's not a good idea.
Nico De Lorenzo and I had a conversation not too long ago about the use of soybean hulls to supplement some of that fiber because we were in a hay deficit scenario this year because we're so short. And if you start supplementing too much, you end up with a diet that's too hot and causing other issues with the beef cattle. Yes. So the soy hulls came as an alternative fiber. But I want to take a step back. Why are we in a state of deficit forage in the diets?
I think you hit solidly on it when we started. Is Florida is the home to some very large dairies. There are a lot of mouths to feed. And as you've mentioned, there are restrictions on the land base, okay? So how many acres can you go over for a given farm? So we have corn silage, which is going to do a great job of providing tonnage of a desirable quality. Then you can't fill the entire need for a herd. What is your secondary crop? I started working at University of Florida back in 1996, at the point in time when there were quote-unquote one-shot diets used in the state. And those are diets that maybe had about 25% forage in them.
Was it a forage quality that they would not want to have more forage because it would decline the quality of the overall diet?
It was a deliberate effort because what a one-shot was is you had, okay, this is Mary Beth's interpretation of a one-shot diet. There was about maybe 15 pounds of not really good Bahia grass hay or Bermuda coastal. And then the grain that they fed with that was cottonseed hulls. It had citrus pulp in it and a minimal amount of starch. And they found that they could get cows to milk off of it. It wasn't super high production because if you have something like cottonseed hulls, they're 20% lignin, indigestible. But they came up with a system that would work. And at the time, even the farms that were working with total mixed rations were down around somewhere around 40% maybe for forage. And I think probably part of that was figuring out under the conditions in which we grow forages here, how do you get corn silage to preserve well? How do you manage it well? I mean, when I first got here, someone in the department asked me, well, Mary Beth, you're here as a dairy cattle nutritionist. Why are you looking at forage? The mindset has changed entirely, and it's to the benefit of the cows and the farms and the use of our resources. So
I would like to go back to the ration that is forage deficient, right? 35 to 45%. And you correctly mentioned, Maribeth, that in Florida, commercial dairies are formulating rations on those lines, right? So I'm pretty sure that audience who are listening to this podcast would be interested in knowing how do we balance this ration? Because the first thing that comes to my mind is that, less forage, more acidosis, but how do we formulate that? Like, what are those parameters that we should look in the ration?
I'll have to give you $5 later for asking that question.
Thank you.
Maybe more. Your mindset has to change when you're looking at that diet and realize you cannot formulate by some of the recommendations, not requirements, that have been developed up north. For example, Glenn Broderick had put, from his research that he'd done, on diets that were anywhere from, let's say, 50 to 60% forage, corn silage and alfalfa haylage, for example, where you wanted 5% sugars in the diet, maybe 7% soluble fiber, and let's say anywhere from 25 to 30% starch, okay? And that works fine when you have that much forage in the diet. The cows are chewing their cud, the fiber is there to keep the rumen functioning well, it's fine. If you're at a 35% forage diet or so, what you need to do is that the other things you supplement into the diet keep the rumen healthy, okay? Keep the cow healthy. And starch is not your friend in that regard. On the one-shot diets, they brought the starch down below 20%. Mm-hmm. Okay. What the herds are doing now, I talked to some of the nutritional consultants who are working with Florida herds, and what they're doing is they're running the sugars possibly anywhere from let's say 7 or 8 to 10% of diet dry matter. We didn't have a good number for soluble fiber, but the starch is down around 22%, which would be perceived low if you were on a much higher fiber forage diet points north. And what they're doing is to fill in the rest of the dry matter is they are bringing in soy hulls. The main changes they're doing is they're stepping away from starch and bringing in other non-fiber carbohydrates that behave better in the rumen. Like, for example, I did most of my work at USDA and started it here on sugars, trying to understand how they worked in dairy cattle diets. And what it turns out is sugars aren't fast starch. They can be used or disappear rapidly with microbes, but the microbes store a lot of it as glycogen. They store it as starch, and that slows down its fermentation. And so they're not having the negative effect on rumen pH, which can precipitate ruminal acidosis and the things you would be scared of on a higher starch diet and that we had seen previously in Florida before the mindset was changing about how do we formulate around low forage. We don't aim for energy. we look at the components we're bringing in that are digestible and how they're going to act in the rumen and the animal.
Thank you very much for sharing that. And I just have a follow-up question on that. So yes, we can balance the diet with less starch and more sugars, and hopefully we can maintain rumen health and they are not acidotic. So one of the slide that I keep thinking about is that when we are looking at the NDF levels on those diets, high forage, low forage, the NDF levels are almost similar because the NDF is coming from byproducts. Yeah.
Yes.
Now going back to the effective fiber here. So when we are formulating a diet that has 35 to 45% forage, what source of effective fiber I think we should be looking at?
What you can get. With effective fiber, okay, processed corn silage, okay? I mean, look at straw as though it was a concentrated effective fiber source, right? You don't need much to do a lot because it's buoyant, so it floats in the rumen. It's not just going to pass. It's going to degrade slowly by the rumen microbes, so it hangs around longer. And if it's 1 to 2 inches long in a moist diet, the cow won't sort it as much. She'll consume it, and it'll hang around longer to do its job of keeping her chewing. And actually, an important thing about effective fiber is that it helps to retain other feeds in the rumen so that they can be digested by the microbes to make microbial protein, fermentation acids, which provide energy to the cow. And so effective fiber is something that you can monitor with watching cow performance, cow rumination, and so forth. And any of the things that we're doing with sugars and bringing in pectins, the soluble fiber, and the fermentable fiber, the fermentable NDF, are all things that I perceive that we're doing to keep the rumen functioning, to provide nutrients, but not leaning towards creating an insult to the cow and the rumen that will go beyond what effective fiber we're giving her. So you've got to watch the cows when we're doing this. Now, something that goes to your question, back in 2001, Dr. Jack Van Horn and I published a survey that we did with nutritional consultants across the United States, including Florida. And I asked the nutritionists, do you know what a healthy cow looks like? And if they answered yes, we were good. And can you send me diets that you can tell me highly productive cows are actually eating? Okay. I got these in. We took a look at the pattern of sugars, soluble fiber, and starch relative to forage, relative to NDF. And it was really interesting. As you went down in NDF, the amount of sugars came up and soluble fiber did. As you had a lot more forage, the starch went up. Now, what we don't know from that work is to what degree it was based on availability of feeds in an area. Yeah. What they were accustomed to, what their resources were, what the prices were. What would be really, really useful is to see about repeating that, but in Florida, with the mindset change on how we keep animals healthy and what we can do with forage in the diet. It would be really, really useful to collect enough information to know how pieces fit together so people are more likely to know what their options are for formulating the diets under different conditions. That would be really useful.
Excellent.
So thinking about that and how to formulate, and considering the portfolio of forages we can grow here in Florida, which are many, we can say they might not be the best quality ever, but there are many. I think they have a function.
Yes.
And that's the important part. What do you think has the greatest potential to be looked at and potentially introduced into the dairy cattle diet, especially considering those situations where the effective fiber is a problem or the excessive starch is being a problem, and we need to bring something, in this case straw. What are the other ones, what forages that would have potential to feed that bill?
Well, first things first, just minor adjustment here. I would say straw, but I don't want the farmers below I-4 cussing me for that, because one of the comments that came back from a nutritional consultant is he would like to add some of that to the diets in the farms down towards Okeechobee, but it's too expensive to ship it there. So having native grown forage could be extraordinarily useful. I mean, part of the discussion I've been hearing since I've been here has been about limpo grass or Mothria. Digestible. It has a stem that might potentially be more buoyant. You can stockpile it. And I was told that it also ensiles well. I think that's some of the work that you'd been doing, Diwakar?
Yes, that's correct, Maribeth. And we have been looking at some of these tropical grasses and the ensiling potential of these grasses. And so far, the results looks promising. So as long as we know how we are chopping it, at what stage of harvest we are getting those grasses, we can ensile them.
And inoculant becomes important there as well?
Exactly. That's a very correct point, yes.
Okay.
Yeah, what is interesting, especially about limper grass, that sometimes, despite not being the highest quality, it ends up being the best in siling, and it doesn't make sense because same way as here, same way as Bermuda, it does not have a lot of water-soluble carbohydrates to ferment, but for some reason, we're able to get pretty decent silage quality, and we have replicated that across many studies in North Florida and South Florida.
That is pretty neat. Whenever you get a crop like limpo grass, it's going to be a matter of deciding what you think its role can be in the diet. And it can be multiple. It can be a multi-tool on the physical fiber as well as on the digestibility, but then doing the testing to find out how do cows respond to it under the different dietary conditions where you're looking at it to work, right? Because the farms are going to need to be able to manage this. The nutritionists are going to need to understand where that particular tool fits in their toolbox to make productive cows. When it's come to small grain silages, for example, those have good potential as a winter crop, obviously, and things like ryegrass. It depends what you need. I mean, I know there are dairies here in Florida who have worked with ryegrass for years, and they're doing it successfully. And some have told me that it's the equivalent of rocket fuel. And, a main concern is that it doesn't interfere with planting corn, right, for when it needs to be harvested. So it depends. Within the management of the farm, what do you got? With the small grains, like when you get into triticale and such, it's finding out what you need to do to harvest it so you get the product that you want. I mean, one of the things, whether it's your warm season grasses, your cool season grasses, these small grain forages, as the fiber content increases, the digestibility goes down. And so part of it is, how do you work with these forages that are going to be changing in what they offer to the cow? But either thing they could offer could be really useful, whether they're slightly less digestible but give you more effective fiber, or a lot more digestible. Where do they fit in the diet? It's, again, what is their role and how does the farm management within the scheme of the farm? Yep.
I always hear about this conflict between agronomists and nutritionists on farm, and that's where we're going to identify the conflict now, because the forage that I can produce, especially when we're thinking about some of those alternative forages that might not have that steady quality,
Yep.
because it is going to depend on the maturity, it's going to depend on other factors for the ensiling process. And on the nutrition side, the nutritionist is not going to accept that variability. How can we handle that?
You got to go talk to the dairy farmer. I mean, part of the discussion today, too, was about when they harvest a crop, they get to decide if they have heifers, is it going to the heifers or is it going to the cows? And the variability comes into that. The reason that agronomists have problems with the nutritionist is because then farmers then have problems with the nutritionist. The thing about dairy cattle is if you make a change today, depending on the change, good, bad, or indifferent, the farmer will see what the cows decided to do with it in the next few days. And when that immediately happens, the nutritionist gets a call.
Yeah.
And hopefully it's a happy call, but not always. And so when you're dealing with forages that are particularly variable in the quality that you've got sitting on the farm to be used, it means they're going to have a lower inclusion level. I mean, when you look at the sorghum, when you look at corn silage, actually the digestibility of those forages didn't change much as NDF came up. And the basis for that is they're being harvested when they're mature. The biggest things that ended up changing were the amount of starch in them as more NDF accumulated, more fiber accumulated. And so that's the thing you see. And if you're using these male sterile sorghums, if they're accumulating sugars, the feedback I got is that even if you put them up really wet, because I was told they were miserable to pack, don't even think about it, maybe they didn't say exactly that, but it was problematic. It still fermented with enough sugars so that it preserved well. So going back to the alternative crops, there may be places for it, but it depends in what quantity and what are your other options. I mean, there are times that if in a drought year, you take what you can get and you figure out how to work with it from there. Standing over at the field plots today, I was standing there with the department chair of agronomy, and we were looking at the Bahia grass, and I'm thinking, boy, that grass actually looks nice. And then we're picking it up and like, okay, it has no stems, it's only leaves, and all the leaves are pretty compact. And I'm thinking, you better harvest this young so that you get what you want. But it's flexible enough and thin enough. What are you going to have that is going to keep that grass in the rumen so it could be fermented? So again, it's looking at what the options are and then actually doing the feeding trials to see what their impact is, as opposed to us, even in a phenomenally good podcast with colleagues, sitting here and thinking we'll know what happens. Okay? Cows are the only ones who are always right.
Because we need to take a look at the cows.
Absolutely.
This podcast was brought to you by the University of Florida Forage Team with technical support from the UF Cows Faculty Instructional Resource and Support Team. This episode was produced by Marcelo Wallau, Olivia Mowley, and Ashley Calabrowski. I hope you have enjoyed this conversation. And if you have any feedback, please leave us a comment in our social media or send us an email to forages@ifas.ufl.edu. Until the next one,